Year-old Amaris Green, who asks, when you were a young girl, did you dream of becoming a president?
No.
No?
No, I didn't have such great dreams. Not when I was a young girl. I just thought I'll be like my mother, grew up to be a teacher. But life has many twists and turns, and when that twist comes and you find yourself on that curve that takes you a different road, then you grasp the moment and you seize the opportunity and you go for it, and that's what happened to me.
Great, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I'd also like to thank National Press Club members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. Also thanks to the NPC Library for research. The video archive of the lunch is provided by the Press Club's Broadcast Operations Center. Press Club members can also access free transcripts.
Up next, a House Financial Services Committee hearing with Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke. After that, a forum examines future strategies for U.S. foreign aid. And then remarks by the President of Liberia. When the U.S. Senate gavels in at noon Eastern Saturday, they'll take up a vote at 1:45 Eastern on whether to proceed to their version of an Iraq resolution. The House passed a non-binding resolution today, 246 to 182. It disapproves of the President's plan to send more troops to Iraq. You'll find more online. Watch floor speeches, news conferences, and hearings, all at cspan.org.
Here are some of the highlights this President's Day weekend on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. Saturday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, author Bruce Feiler, an encore book notes discussion about his book Abraham, recently read by President Bush. Then at 10, Senator Chuck Schumer, author of Positively American, and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, author of Winning the Future, debate the topics of their two books. On Sunday, join our live call-in programs beginning at 3 p.m. First, British historian Andrew Roberts, whose new book argues the supremacy of the English-speaking people in the 20th century. Then Chalmers Johnson takes your calls on the final installment of his trilogy on the American Empire. And on Monday, Tom Wheeler, author of Mr. Lincoln's T-Mails, and Harold Holzer, author of Lincoln at Cooper Union, discuss Abraham Lincoln's interest in technology and his use of the telegraph during the Civil War. That's this President's Day weekend on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. For a complete list of programs and times, go to booktv.org.
Next, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke testifies on the state of the U.S. economy, interest rates, inflation, and the budget deficit. This week, the central bank released the semi-annual Monetary Policy Report. Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank chairs this House Financial Services Committee hearing. It's about 3.5 hours.
The hearing of the Committee on Financial Services will come to order. This is the semi-annual hearing that we have pursuant to the Humphrey-Hawkins Act with the Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, who will be testifying on the state of the economy and has presented the Monetary Policy Report to the Congress. Under the procedures, the Chairman alternates. This is done twice a year. Once the Chairman goes to the Senate first, once he goes to the House first. Since in this rotation he went to the Senate first, one assumes that there will be no opportunities to game the stock market today. Those all happened yesterday. So people can stay through the whole hearing. Reporters won't have to leave to run to report to the services. So people can hysterically overreact to the Chairman's perfectly sensible statements, which is, of course, the pattern. Although I know people who are in the market explain that they are not overreacting themselves. They are, in fact, reacting to other people's overreaction, although the consequence is the same. I say that because in the interest of being able to have rational policy discussions unconstrained by irrelevant factors, I just would plead with people, not to read excessively into what the chairman says, not to read excessively into what we say. We ought to be able to have rational conversations about the important topics of today's hearings without these overreactions. And I would say, since that may not be possible, as far as I'm concerned, people overreact at their own peril. And I don't think the chairman or anybody else ought to be held accountable because people engage in this form of anticipatory hysteria. As to the subject at hand, and under the rules, there will be 4 opening statements by myself, the ranking member of the full committee, the chair of the subcommittee on domestic and international monetary policy, and the ranking member of the subcommittee. The chairman has very graciously agreed to stay till 2 p.m., and I am deeply appreciative. This is a very large committee. We will take one 15 or 20-minute break, but members can gauge that appropriately, and we may be able to accommodate. We'll be able to accommodate more of the members than we usually can. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your willingness to do this. I will be asking the chairman about some of the specifics of his testimony and of the areas particularly relevant to monetary policy, but I want to begin with an expression of disappointment, not in Chairman Bernanke, but in the business community, many of my conservative colleagues. I believe that we are at a very sensitive point in the making of economic policy in this country. There is, on the part of the business community and many of its supporters, the view that a full embrace of globalization, of technological change, essentially of public policies that allow capital to be fully mobilized and fully mobile, able to be employed to its best use, that this is in the best interests of society as a whole. For some time now, until fairly recently, that was the governing policy in the U.S. and in much of the rest of the world. That has now come to an end, I believe, temporarily, perhaps for a long temporary period, because increasingly average citizens in America and in other countries have come to doubt that the growth that results from this policy of entirely free capital to move to wherever it finds its best return, people have come to doubt that this is in their interest. Indeed, there are a large number of people throughout the world who believe that they're being hurt by this. And in consequence, we are at a policy deadlock. I think people should understand that the chances of an extension of trade promotion authority going through are quite slender at this point, unless there is some change in the attitude of many who are its advocates. My own view is that if they were in fact to come to an agreement in the Doha round, that the resulting agreement, if they reached it as they are currently talking about it, wouldn't pass the House of Representatives. There is resistance, in my view, unfortunately, to the general approach the President took on immigration. In almost all of the important areas in which, and let me just say, this committee reported out earlier this week on a voice vote a bill for foreign investment. And there was a paradox, because if you talk to the people in the business community, as the ranking member and I and the former chair of that subcommittee dealing with New York and others who were involved in that, if you talk to them, they were on the whole pleased with our result because it was better than they had expected. If you read some of the business press, they were concerned that it was too restrictive. Well, that's an example of where we are. It was a bill that was more restrictive than some might have liked on foreign investment, but better than some people had expected, reflecting this mood. So I just want to reiterate what I've said earlier. Many of us are prepared to work towards policies that are pro-growth, that do take advantage of what you can have when capital is allowed to reach its best level and find its greatest return, when technology can be fully taken advantage of. But only if we put in place public policies that make sure that that is more fairly shared, and in particular, that reverse the tendency, which the chairman has acknowledged, and I appreciate that, which even the president has acknowledged, that inequality has been growing. As I said before, inequality is an essential part of a capitalist economy. No one is trying to get rid of it, at least no one's sensible. But it can also become excessive to the point where it is socially harmful and economically beyond what is needed for the capitalist system. We're at that point. We're at a point where there is an excessive amount of inequality in this economy, and it is growing, and not just in this economy. I noted a comment recently, and I'm giving myself the extra minute or two that I took for explaining it the first. I recently read an article which said that in the last set of state elections in India, every chief minister who was seen as pro-foreign was defeated in terms of the economy. So there is a worldwide concern. We see it in Latin America, where an anti-democratic left is threatening the democratic left, in part because of this economic unhappiness. I don't see any recognition of that. I regret that, but people who will continue to resist are trying to do something about health care, are trying to do something about the right of employees to join unions. Even something as minimalist as the minimum wage should not be surprised when they run into absolute resistance to other things which they will argue are good for the economy. With that, I will recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. And I appreciate you holding this hearing. And Chairman Bernanke, thank you for your report. As you can see on this committee, we share the same concerns, but we share different views on how to address those concerns and different philosophies. And as you come before us today, we're interested in your insights regarding not only monetary policy, but also the state of the economy, and as the Chairman specifically mentioned, global competitiveness and trade and issues of that nature. Of course, when we talk about differences of philosophy, as the Chairman and I have on how to approach these issues, how one perceives the state of the economy greatly depends on one's point of view. From my perspective, the economy appears strong and vibrant, and absent some unforeseen shock, likely to remain so. When I look at your report and the supporting economic data, I see vigorous 3.4% growth. I see low unemployment of 4.6% and inflation of 2.5%. In a society where opportunity awaits anyone who uses their talents and efforts to improve the standard of living for their family. Opportunities are there, educational opportunities, work opportunities. That's what I see from your report. I see 7.5 million new jobs created since 2003. I see a structurally sound economy performing as well as it did in the 1990s in what we now know was an artificial economic bubble. Currently, I see strong 2.2 productivity increases and record stock market levels, not fueled by unrealistic dot-com speculation, but by globally competitive businesses. I also see most Americans benefiting from the stock market growth through individual stock ownership and retirement funds. In this environment, claiming that record corporate profits do not benefit most Americans, as some on this committee do, is not a valid argument. Others have a different perspective. You heard the Chairman's perspective, and they see another reality. Some on this committee believe the best way to create jobs and promote economic growth is through aggressive trade restrictions and barriers. While I recognize the need to help those economically displaced, or as the Chairman says, hurt by global forces beyond their control, economic experience does not lead me to the conclusion that protectionism or isolationism is an appropriate response. Some think we need to somehow mandate the elimination of income disparities. While I share the exasperation of the Chairman over some of the outrageous CEO compensation recently reported, I believe our corporate governance system works and that shareholders will correct these abuses without government interference. I believe education, not government attempts to redistribute income, is the proven route to improve wages for all workers. Chairman Bernanke, the members of this committee, Republicans and Democrats alike, respect your experience, your judgment, and your obvious commitment to keeping America's economy strong and competitive. We all share a goal of doing that and doing what's best for American workers. We appreciate you being here and look forward to hearing your comments.
The gentleman from Illinois, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Domestic and International Monetary Policy, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Frank. Chairman Bernanke, I think it's safe to say that you and I have different backgrounds and that we bring disparate perspectives to the table when dealing with economic and monetary issues. But after taking over the chairmanship of the Monetary Policy Subcommittee, I'm getting a sense of the significant and daunting task that you face. You should rest assured, however, that I will be here over the next 2 years along with 443 members of the House and 100 members of the other body to second-guess your every move. When it comes to economic and monetary policy, we are entering a very crucial and complex period, especially for the Federal Reserve and its mandate of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. For example, the housing boom has taken a substantial downturn. Energy prices have climbed, and we are facing some serious issues about our long-term energy security. Some economists warn of the threat of inflation on the horizon, yet others appear less worried about inflation than the rising mortgage delinquencies and foreclosures affecting a wider economy. The two major Asian currencies are undervalued, and the U.S. trade deficit is at record highs, while accusations of currency manipulations are frequently leveled against both China and Japan. And perhaps most important of all, we face a huge federal deficit at a time when baby boomers are reaching retirement age and health care costs are at an all-time high. While I'm anxious to hear from you, Mr. Bernanke, on these issues, what concerns me most is retirement insecurity. When it comes to kitchen table issues, retirement insecurity is the obstacle for many American families. The U.S. economy is now producing over $13 trillion a year, but many American families are struggling just to maintain their living standards, and they are up against stagnating wages, diminishing health care, and retirement benefits that are just disappearing. More and more families are living paycheck to paycheck with very little in their bank accounts or none at all, and paying higher interest rates and more fees than they should. And hanging over their heads is retirement. I know, Mr. Chairman Bernanke, that you have publicly addressed the related issues of retirement insecurity, the budget deficit, and the looming retirement of 78 million baby boomers on several occasions. But from what I've heard and read, you have approached the problem only in terms of entitlement reform. Entitlement reform is needed, no question. But this is not just an issue of entitlement reform. The skyrocketing costs of health care are not just going to disappear if we reduce entitlement spending. The cost will just be shifted to already strapped family budgets. Many baby boomers are simply not financially ready for retirement. If we substantially cut health care, Social Security spending for the baby boomer generation, many will face health care crises that will drive them into bankruptcy. The correlation between rising health care expenses and personal bankruptcy filings is well documented. And merely moving these expenses from the public sector to the American family is, in my opinion, not good for long-term economic growth. We need more than entitlement reform to give Americans retirement security. I would like to hear your views on this today. Clearly, no single political party and no single body, the Fed, the Congress, the administration, has the answers to the problems we face. We must work together, and I look forward to an open, frank dialogue with the Federal Reserve, my subcommittee counterpart, Dr. Paul, and the Treasury Department on all these issues. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas, the ranking member of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Bernanke. I am very pleased to be here today as the ranking member, and in the midst of the great optimism of monetary policy and how the economy is doing, I still have some concerns. And of course, one of my long-term goals has always been to emphasize maintaining the integrity of the monetary unit rather than looking superficially at some of our statistics. But I also share the concern of the chairman of the committee of our responsibilities for oversight and your interest as well, Chairman Bernanke, on having the transparency that I think we all desire. Transparency in monetary policy is a goal we should all support. I've often wondered why Congress has so willingly given up this prerogative over monetary policy. Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank. Congress created the Federal Reserve, yet it had no constitutional authority to do so. We forget that those powers not explicitly granted to the Congress by the Constitution are inherently denied to the Congress, and thus the authority to establish a central bank was never given. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton had that debate early on, and the debate seemingly was settled in 1913. But transparency and oversight are something else, and they're worth considering. Congress, although not by law, essentially has given up all its oversight responsibilities over the Fed. There are no true audits. Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks. We get less and less information regarding the money supply each year, especially now that we don't even have access to M3 statistics. The role the Fed plays in the President's secretive working group on financial markets goes essentially unnoticed by Congress. The Federal Reserve shows no willingness to inform Congress voluntarily about how often the working group meets, what action it takes that affects the financial markets, or why it takes these actions. But all these actions directed by the Federal Reserve alter the purchasing power of our money. And that purchasing power is always reduced. The dollar today is worth only 4 cents compared to the dollar that the Federal Reserve started with in 1913. This has significant consequences on our economy and our political stability. All paper currencies are vulnerable to collapse, and history is replete with examples of great suffering caused by these collapses, especially to the nation's poor and the middle class. This can lead to political turmoil as well. Even before a currency collapses, the damage done by a fiat system is significant. Our monetary system insidiously transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the privileged rich. Wages never keep up with profits on Wall Street and the banks, thus sowing the seeds of class and discontent. When economic trouble hits, free markets and free trade are often blamed, while the harmful effects of a fiat monetary system are ignored. We deceive ourselves that all is well with the economy and ignore the fundamental flaws that are a source of growing discontent among the various groups. Few understand that our consumption and apparent wealth is dependent on a current account deficit running at approximately $800 billion a year. This deficit shows that much of our prosperity is based on borrowing rather than a true increase in production. Statistics show year after year that our productive manufacturing jobs I think they finally cut me off. Is it on now? Okay. This phenomenon is not seen as a consequence of the international fiat monetary system where the United States government benefits as the issuer of the world reserve currency. Government officials consistently claim that inflation is in check at barely 2%, but middle-class Americans know that their purchasing power, especially when it comes to housing, energy, and medical care and school tuition, is shrinking much faster than at 2% per year. Even if prices are held in check, in spite of our monetary inflation, concentrating on the CPI statistics distracts from the real issue. We must address the important consequences of the Fed manipulation of interest rates. When interest rates are artificially low, below market rates, insidious malinvestment and excessive indebtedness inevitably brings about the economic downturns that everyone dreads. We look at GDP figures and reassure ourselves that all is well, yet a growing number of Americans still do not enjoy the high standard of living that monetary inflation brings to the privileged few. Those who benefit the most are the ones who get to use the newly created credit first.
The gentleman's time has expired. If the gentleman would come to a conclusion.
Okay, I will yield back.
I will now turn to the chairman, and he is recognized for his opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Frank, Representative BACHUS. and other members of the committee, I am pleased to present the Federal Reserve's Monetary Policy Report to the Congress.
Mr. Chairman, could you pull your mic a little bit closer to you?
Thank you. Real activity in the United States expanded at a solid pace in 2006, although the pattern of growth was uneven. After a first quarter rebound from weakness associated with the effects of the hurricanes that ravaged the Gulf Coast in the previous summer, output growth moderated somewhat on average over the remainder of 2006. Real gross domestic product is currently estimated to have increased at an annual rate of about 2.75% in the second half of the year. As we anticipated in our July report, the U.S. economy appears to be making a transition from the rapid rate of expansion experienced over the preceding several years to a more sustainable average pace of growth. The principal source of the ongoing moderation has been a substantial cooling in the housing market, which has led to a marked slowdown in the pace of residential construction. However, the weakness in housing market activity and the slower appreciation of house prices do not seem to have spilled over to any significant extent to other sectors of the economy. Consumer spending has continued to expand at a solid rate, and the demand for labor remains strong. On average, about 165,000 jobs per month have been added to non-farm payrolls over the past 6 months, and the unemployment rate at 4.6% in January remains low. Inflation pressures appear to have abated somewhat following a run-up during the first half of 2006. Overall inflation has fallen, in large part as a result of declines in the price of crude oil. Readings on core inflation, that is inflation excluding the prices of food and energy, have improved modestly in recent months. Nevertheless, the core inflation rate remains somewhat elevated. In the 5 policy meetings since the July report, the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, has maintained the federal funds rate at 5.25%. So far, the incoming data have supported the view that the current stance of policy is likely to foster sustainable economic growth and a gradual ebbing of core inflation. However, in the statement accompanying last month's policy decision, the FOMC again indicated that its predominant policy concern is the risk that inflation will fail to ease as expected, and that it is prepared to take action to address inflation risks if developments warrant. Let me now discuss the economic outlook in a little more detail, beginning with developments in the real economy and then turning to inflation. I will conclude with some brief comments on monetary policy. Consumer spending continues to be the mainstay of the current economic expansion. Personal consumption expenditures, which account for more than 2/3 of aggregate demand, increased at an annual rate of around 3.5% in real terms during the second half of last year, broadly matching the brisk pace of the previous 3 years. Consumer outlays were supported by strong gains in personal income, reflecting both the ongoing increases in payroll employment and a pickup in the growth of real wages. Real hourly compensation, as measured by compensation per hour in the non-farm business sector, deflated by the personal consumption expenditures price index, rose at an annual rate of around 3% in the latter half of 2006. The resilience of consumer spending is all the more striking given the backdrop of the substantial correction in the housing market that became increasingly evident during the spring and summer of last year. By the middle of 2006, monthly sales of new and existing homes were about 15% lower than a year earlier, and the previously rapid rate of house price appreciation had slowed markedly. The fall in housing demand, in turn, prompted a sharp slowing in the pace of construction of new homes. Even so, the backlog of unsold homes rose from about 4.5 months' supply in 2005 to nearly 7 months' supply by the third quarter of last year. Single-family housing starts have dropped more than 30% since the beginning of last year, and employment growth in the construction sector has slowed substantially. Some tentative signs of stabilization have recently appeared in the housing market. New and existing home sales have flattened out in recent months. Mortgage applications have picked up, and some surveys find that homebuyers' sentiment has improved. However, even if housing demand falls no further, weakness in residential investment is likely to continue to weigh on economic growth over the next few quarters, as home builders seek to reduce their inventories of unsold homes to more comfortable levels. Despite the ongoing adjustments in the housing sector, overall economic prospects for households remain good. Household finances appear generally solid, and delinquency rates on most types of consumer loans and residential mortgages remain low. The exception is subprime mortgages with variable interest rates, for which delinquency rates have increased appreciably. The labor market is expected to stay healthy, and real incomes should continue to rise, although the pace of employment gains may be slower than that to which we have become accustomed in recent years. In part, slower average job growth may simply reflect a moderation of economic activity. Also, the impending retirement of the leading edge of the baby boom generation, an apparent leveling out of women's participation rate in the workforce, which had risen for several decades, will likely restrain the growth of the labor force in coming years. With fewer job seekers entering the labor force, the rate of job creation associated with the maintenance of stable conditions in the labor market will decline. All told, consumer expenditures appear likely to expand solidly in coming quarters, albeit a little less rapidly than the growth in personal incomes, if, as we expect, households respond to the slow pace of home equity appreciation by saving more out of current income. The business sector remains in excellent financial condition with strong growth in profits, liquid balance sheets, and corporate leverage near historical lows. Last year, those factors helped to support continued advances in business capital expenditures. Notably, investment in high-tech equipment rose 9% in 2006, and spending on non-residential structures such as office buildings, factories, and retail space increased rapidly through much of the year after several years of weakness. Growth in business spending slowed toward the end of last year, reflecting mainly a deceleration of spending on business structures, a drop in outlays in the transportation sector, where spending is notably volatile, and some weakness in purchases of equipment related to construction and motor vehicle manufacturing. Over the coming year, capital spending is poised to expand at a moderate pace, supported by steady gains in business output and favorable financial conditions. Inventory levels in some sectors, most notably at motor vehicle dealers and in some construction-related manufacturing industries, rose over the course of last year, leading some firms to cut production to better align inventories with sales. Remaining imbalances may continue to impose modest restraint on industrial production during the early part of this year. Outside the United States, economic activity in our major trading partners has continued to grow briskly. The strength of demand abroad helped spur a robust expansion in U.S. real exports, which grew about 9% last year. The pattern of real U.S. imports was somewhat uneven, partly because of fluctuations in oil imports over the course of the year. On balance, import growth slowed in 2006 to 3%. Economic growth abroad should further support steady growth in U.S. exports this year. Despite the improvements in trade performance, the U.S. current account deficit remains large, averaging about 6.5% of nominal GDP during the first 3 quarters of 2006. Overall, the U.S. economy seems likely to expand at a moderate pace this year and next, with growth strengthening somewhat as the drag from housing diminishes. Such an outlook is reflected in the projections that the members of the Board of Governors and presidents of the Federal Reserve Banks made around the time at the FOMC meeting late last month. The central tendency of those forecasts, which are based on the information available at that time and on the assumption of appropriate monetary policy, is for real GDP to increase about 2.5% to 3% in 2007 and about 2.75% to 3% in 2008. The projection for GDP growth in 2007 is slightly lower than our projection last July. This difference partly reflects an expectation of somewhat greater weakness in residential construction during the first part of this year than we anticipated last summer. The civilian unemployment rate is expected to finish both 2007 and 2008 around 4.5% to 4.75%. The risks to this outlook are significant. To the downside, the ultimate extent of the housing market correction is difficult to forecast and may prove greater than we anticipate. Similarly, spillover effects from developments in the housing market onto consumer spending and employment and housing-related industries may be more pronounced than expected. To the upside, output may expand more quickly than expected if consumer spending continues to increase at the brisk pace seen in the second half of 2006. I turn now to the inflation situation. As I noted earlier, there are some indications that inflation pressures are beginning to diminish. The monthly data are noisy, however, and it will consequently be some time before we can be confident that underlying inflation is moderating as anticipated. Recent declines in overall inflation have primarily reflected lower prices for crude oil, which have fed through to the prices of gasoline, heating oil, and other energy products used by consumers. After moving higher in the first half of 2006, core consumer price inflation has also edged lower recently, reflecting a relatively broad-based deceleration in the prices of core goods. That deceleration is probably also due to some extent to lower energy prices, which have reduced costs of production and thereby lessened one source of pressure on the prices of final goods and services. The ebbing of core inflation has likely been promoted as well by the stability of inflation expectations. A waning of the temporary factors that boosted inflation in recent years will probably help foster a continued edging down of core inflation. In particular, futures quotes imply that oil prices are expected to remain well below last year's peak. If actual prices follow the path currently indicated by futures prices, inflation pressures would be reduced further as the benefits of the decline in oil prices from last year's high levels are passed through to a broader range of core goods and services. Non-fuel import prices may also put less pressure on core inflation, particularly if price increases for some other commodities, such as metals, slow from last year's rapid rates. But as we have been reminded only too well in recent years, the prices of oil and other commodities are notoriously difficult to predict, and they remain a key source of uncertainty in the inflation outlook. The contribution from rents and shelter costs should also fall back following a step up last year. The faster pace of rent increases last year may have been attributable in part to the reduced affordability of owner-occupied housing, which led to a greater demand for rental housing. Rents should rise somewhat less quickly this year and next, reflecting recovering demand for owner-occupied housing, as well as increases in the supply of rental units, but the extent and pace of that adjustment is not yet clear. Upward pressure on inflation could materialize if final demand were to exceed the underlying productive capacity of the economy for a sustained period. The rate of resource utilization is high, as can be seen in rates of capacity utilization above their long-term average and most evidently in the tightness of the labor market. Indeed, anecdotal reports suggest that businesses are having difficulty recruiting well-qualified workers in certain occupations. Measures of labor compensation, though still growing at a moderate pace, have shown some signs of acceleration over the past year, likely in part the result of tight labor market conditions. The implications for inflation of faster growth in nominal labor compensation depend on several factors. Increases in compensation might be offset by higher labor productivity or absorbed by a narrowing of firms' profit margins rather than passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. In these circumstances, gains in nominal compensation would translate into gains in real compensation as well. Underlying productivity trends appear favorable, and the markup of prices over unit labor costs is high by historical standards, so such an outcome is certainly possible. Moreover, if activity expands over the next year or so at the moderate pace anticipated by the FOMC, pressures in both labor and product markets should ease modestly. That said, the possibility remains that tightness in product markets could allow firms to pass higher labor costs through to prices, adding to inflation and effectively nullifying the purchasing power of at least some portion of the increase in labor compensation. Thus, the high level of resource utilization remains an important upside risk to continued progress on inflation. Another significant factor influencing medium-term trends in inflation is the public's expectations of inflation. These expectations have an important bearing on whether transitory influences on prices, such as those created by changes in energy costs, become embedded in wage and price decisions and so leave a lasting imprint on the rate of inflation. It is encouraging that inflation expectations appear to have remained contained. The projections of the members of the Board of Governors and the presidents of the Federal Reserve Banks are for inflation to continue to ebb over this year and next. In particular, the central tendency of those forecasts is for core inflation, as measured by the price index for personal consumption expenditures excluding food and energy, to be 2 to 2.25% this year and to edge lower to 1.75 to 2% next year. But as I noted earlier, the FOMC has continued to view the risk that inflation will not moderate as expected as the predominant policy concern. Monetary policy affects spending and inflation with long and variable lags. Consequently, policy decisions must be based on an assessment of medium-term economic prospects. At the same time, because economic forecasting is an uncertain enterprise, policymakers must be prepared to respond flexibly to developments in the economy when those developments lead to a reassessment of the outlook. The dependence of monetary policy actions on a broad range of incoming information complicates the public's attempts to understand and anticipate policy decisions. Clear communication by the central bank about the economic outlook, the risk to that outlook, and its monetary policy strategy can help the public to understand the rationale behind policy decisions and to anticipate better the central bank's reaction to new information. This understanding should in turn enhance the effectiveness of policy and lead to improved economic outcomes. By reducing uncertainty, central bank transparency may also help anchor the public's longer-term expectations of inflation. Much experience has shown that well-anchored inflation expectations help to stabilize inflation and promote maximum sustainable economic growth. Good communication by the central bank is also vital for ensuring appropriate accountability for its policy actions, the full effects of which can be observed only after a lengthy period. A transparent policy process improves accountability by clarifying how a central bank expects to attain its policy objectives and by ensuring that policy is conducted in a manner that can be seen to be consistent with achieving those objectives. Over the past decade or so, the Federal Reserve has significantly improved its methods of communication, but further progress is possible. As you know, the FOMC last year established a subcommittee to help the full committee evaluate the next steps in this continuing process. Our discussions are directed at examining all aspects of our communications and have been deliberate and thorough. These discussions are continuing and no decisions have been reached. My colleagues and I remain firmly committed to an open and transparent monetary policy process that enhances our ability to achieve our dual objectives of stable prices and maximum sustainable employment. I will keep members of this committee apprised of developments as our deliberations move forward. I look forward to continuing to work closely with the members of this committee and your colleagues in the Senate and House on the important issues pertaining to monetary policy and the other responsibilities with which the Congress has charged the Federal Reserve. Thank you. I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say that when you say you would be happy to take questions, you were somewhat more persuasive than when your predecessor used to say that. And I will apologize in advance to the media because you have, I think, over the past months in particular, said some very reasonable things from my standpoint, so I have less to complain about than they might have hoped. I'm sure quarrels will arise, so they should not lose heart. I particularly want to begin by thanking you for the very appropriately nuanced discussion of wages. It has troubled me for some time that, particularly when I read some of the financial pages, there is a good news, bad news story. The good news is that profits are up, and the bad news is that wages are up. And wages are too often written about as if they were simply a constraint on prosperity. And I particularly appreciate on page 7 of your testimony where you note that an increase in wages, certainly to the level of productivity, should not be a problem, and that in general, there's nothing automatic about a rise in wages leading to inflation. It depends on the impact on prices. And in that context, I especially welcome your noting that not only that underlying productivity trends appear favorable, and this is in your discussion of wages and inflation, underlying productivity trends appear favorable, and the markup of prices over unit labor costs is high by historical standards. I hope this is widely noted. Your statement that, in fact, there would not appear to be wage-driven pressure to raise prices because, as you note, the markup of prices over costs in this regard is high by historical standards. I would add, you did not cover that, it wasn't in your topic, that there has also been a reduction in the tax burden. So we ought to be clear that this simplistic notion that if wages go up, that's going to cause inflation is not the case, and that in fact there is, as you say, and I appreciate this, some reason, some room for legitimate wage increases to be absorbed without that being inflationary. Now, there is, however, some bias still in the way we talk about things. And I did note that there was great relief that you apparently indicated yesterday that it is unlikely that you will be presiding over increases in interest rates in the future. But as I read your report, it seems to me, frankly, the question ought to be whether or not there were decreases. On the monetary policy report in the first page, let me read two statements. On balance, growth of real gross domestic product appears likely to run slightly below that of the economy's potential over the next few quarters, and then to rise to a pace around that of the long-run trend. Next paragraph. Regarding inflation, increases in core consumer prices are expected to moderate on balance over the next 2 years. In other words, the prediction is economic growth below the economy's potential for a while, and then reaching potential but not going above it. Similarly, inflation is going to moderate. An economy performing somewhat, not enormously, but somewhat below potential, tending towards potential, and inflation that is expected to moderate, I suppose that would be an argument for balance if nothing changes. But I don't see how we get a concern of inflation as the major concern here. I know you say, well, but you're still worried more about inflation, and the sense is stop him before he raises again, but no likelihood of a drop. I don't understand why this shouldn't make it at least as likely as a drop. We have an economy that's running below potential, and we have moderating inflation. Why is that not at least an equal chance for there to be a reduction in the time ahead? Please.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, policy is going to respond to new information. We're going to be continually reassessing our outlook and responding appropriately as we see the economy evolving. Policy also has to respond to risks. There are risks in both directions. On the real side, I talked about housing as a downside risk, but there's also some upside risk. We've seen some very strong consumer spending numbers. We've seen some strong income growth, which suggests that the economy may be stronger than we think. It's possible. And in the sense that aggregate spending may exceed our capacity and put pressure in product markets, and that would be a concern. The other issue is on inflation. We have had a period where inflation has been above where we'd like to see it as far as consistency with price stability is concerned. In order for this expansion to continue in a sustainable way, inflation needs to be well controlled. If inflation becomes higher for some reason, then the Federal Reserve would have to respond to that by raising interest rates that would not contribute to the continued.
I understand that, Mr. Chairman, but I'm a little puzzled when you said, you tell me that your report says production below potential, rising to potential, but then you say, well, you think it might be more than you think. I mean, if you think it might be more than you think, why didn't you think it? I mean, it does seem to me a little odd for you to say, here's what I think, but I also think it might be worse than I think. That is literally double think. What particularly concerns me is I read those two sentences. Production now below potential, and prediction only to get to potential, not above it, and inflation moderating, and I don't see how that computes with, as I noted earlier, the FOMC has continued to view the risk that inflation will not moderate as the predominant policy concern. I can understand it being a concern. I don't understand how, given this, it outweighs the other. And let me say in that regard, and I want to stick to time limits, I appreciate your discussion about transparency on, and you're discussing this, and I do want to, let me point, there he is. When I got to the Congress in 1981, the Open Market Committee was, from the standpoint of publicity, the closed market committee, because it did not even announce on the day of the vote what the vote was. And that gentleman up there, Mr. Gonzalez of Texas, crusaded, I think, effectively and appropriately for some transparency. We have much more. Here's my concern. When you talk about changing the way you communicate and certainty, here's the problem. It is easier for you to be certain about what you want the interest rate to be than about what you want employment to be, because you have more control of one or the other. I admire the desire for more transparency. I express my concern that procedure and substance may intermix here, and that the argument for greater certainty can become, and you say we have the two objectives, stable employment, stable prices and employment, but one of those might, I mean, I appreciate the fact that you have two children and you love them both, but I'm afraid that one of them might get a little bit more for Hanukkah than the other if we're not careful. So I do want to ask that we be kept involved in this process, but I also want to reiterate, from the standpoint of what I talked about before, from the social health of this country, and I will close, I know there are people who say the economy is very good. Let me be partisan for a minute. I'll say to my Republican friends, keep telling the American people how good the economy is, because the disparity between what you tell them is happening and what they feel themselves makes them even angrier. But this inflation as the predominant concern, given your own statements, it seems to me that you've made an argument that it ought to be at least balanced. That's troubling to me.
Thank you. Chairman Bernanke, the chairman mentioned the economy and our different perspectives and our viewpoints. The chairman and others have said that all these 7.5 million new jobs that have been created are all low-income workers. They're not higher-paying jobs. I noticed that the Bureau of Labor Statistics job data that was released just yesterday indicates that job creation was roughly distributed across the income spectrum. Can you tell me why there is a perspective and whether it's true that this viewpoint that all these new jobs are low income, when I see that the recovery is benefiting the middle class and the creating higher paying jobs?
Well, in terms of the distribution of jobs, as I mentioned in my testimony, there's an enormous demand for high-skilled workers and those high-paying jobs. And the constraint on the highest-paying jobs, for example, in manufacturing, is not the demand but the supply. That firms can't find workers of sufficient qualifications in many different areas. There certainly has been job creation at the high level as well as throughout the distribution of wages.
So the economy is, in fact, creating so many high-paid, skilled jobs that there simply is not the workforce to fill those jobs.
As I've indicated recently, I think one of the major constraints in our economy and one of the sources of concerns about equality and inequality has to do with educational differentials. And the more that we can help people acquire sufficient skills so that they can be eligible for those high-paying jobs, the better off we're going to be.
Thank you. The chairman said he was more pleased with you than he has been in the past. And I'm sure that he read the same article I read in the American Banker where it was titled that you had endorsed the GSE housing fund, that the affordable housing fund that the chairman put forward. When I saw your testimony, I didn't see that in it at all. But let me ask you this question. There is a philosophical debate going on in this committee about the creation of these funds, government control, government mandate, government directed funds. There are really two of them. One is that's gotten all the publicity is the Affordable Housing Fund, which the GSEs will be required to pay a portion of their revenue into. And members of this committee, at least Republican members, we see this as a added cost to low and middle income homeowners. Now, I think across I'll call this a divide. Across the divide, there is an agreement that the GSEs could do a better job on their affordable housing mission. But we are very skeptical that if you take money that is designated to provide liquidity for people to buy homes, you either increase the cost of that home mortgage or the availability of that home mortgage. And we think there's a better way than a government-dictated plan. Clearer, maybe, than that is the other proposal, and it has received almost no publicity, and that's we had a spirited debate in this committee 2 days ago, is that my Democratic colleagues are endorsing an insurance, a insurance companies funding a community reinvestment fund. Massachusetts created such a fund in 1998, where insurance companies are directed to pay part of their income into a fund which I guess the state of Massachusetts directs into affordable housing or community investment projects. And we debated that because we Republicans felt like that when we pay our premiums to an insurance company, we want that money to be invested at the highest possible return so that claims can be paid. We feel like the proper role of an insurance company is not to take our money, the insured's money, and invest it in some community project. The proper role is for them to pay claims. So I just ask you, first of all, would you clarify your remarks over in the Senate, or if there is any clarification needed? And do you have any unease over the creation of more government funds of this nature and the cost on American homeowners or any of us that pay premiums to insurance companies?
Congressman, the story was misreported, misunderstood my position. I did not address the Affordable Housing Fund either pro or con. The concern that the Federal Reserve has had for a long time about GSEs is the potential for their portfolios to create systemic risk in our financial system. I should say, we very much support the GSE's housing mission, and we believe in particular that the securitization function contributes to liquidity in the mortgage market. Again, our concern is about the portfolios and their enormous size and the complex derivative exercises that are needed to maintain the balance of those portfolios. My comment was one that built on suggestions that Chairman Greenspan had made in previous testimonies, which was that one way to limit the growth of the portfolios, but also to achieve the stated public purpose of the GSEs was in some way to anchor the portfolios in the public purpose, which is affordable housing. According to OFEO, only about 30% of the portfolios are related in any way to affordable housing. So what I think I would like to see would be the portfolios to be more directly connected, perhaps holding affordable housing mortgages, or another way, more directly promoting affordable housing rather than acquiring all different kinds of assets that are not related to affordable housing.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, welcome to the committee. It's fascinating to listen to the discussion here, and obviously wide-ranging. But I have a few questions in regard to the emphasis in the public press of the last several months on executive salaries and what the appropriate response would be to them. First of all, I'd like your opinion as to how they rate on that scale of fair, unfair, whether or not they should be subjected to oversight, and if subjected to oversight, should they be subjected to some curative action by the Congress. And particularly, we're looking at the UK's shareholders' rights approach and their ability to give advisory opinions on executive packages. But if you could summarize in some way your views and what the effect would that positively or negatively on the market and the economy, it would be most appreciated.
Thank you. I think it's very important for shareholders to be aware of compensation packages that CEOs are receiving. So if they're displeased, they can register that displeasure by through the directors or through selling the stock. And so I strongly support disclosure efforts. The Securities and Exchange Commission has recently built on the efforts of the exchanges, the NYSE, for example, in requiring more extensive disclosure of compensation packages and all the details. I think that's a very important step in the direction of making sure that shareholders have full information so that they can make appropriate decisions about whether these packages are in the interest of the company or not.
Do you have any opinion as to the United Kingdom's approach of actually enacting advisory opinions expressed by shareholders and whether or not that has had any positive effect on the reduction of some of these packages and or other shareholders' rights litigation and other things that may have been modified. When you look at the numbers, the UK is significantly lower than the American market.